Hi, everyone. Yeah, we're just about to start. Thank you for joining us today at SRRT, the Social Responsibility Roundtable's Afternoon of Social Justice. My name is Amber Hayes, and I am the Office for Diversity, Literacy, and Outreach Services, OTLO's Program Officer. I'm here today to assist with the Native American treaty rights in the time of COVID-19. Before we start, I just want to get through some technical questions. If you have any questions related to your audio, visual, or any tech questions, please use the chat function at the bottom of your screen. It will default automatically to panelists, and someone will be able to assist you privately. If you have any content questions, please go to the bottom of your screen to the Q&A speech bubbles. You'll be able to type your answer there, and our panelists will be able to respond at the end of today's session. Lastly, we will not be using the raise hand function during this presentation. With that, I turn it over to Tom Twiss. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Amber. Hi, everyone. My name is Tom Twiss, and I'm co-chair of the International Responsibilities Task Force of the Social Responsibilities Roundtable of the American Library Association. I'll be chairing this program today together with Cindy Hohl, who is president-elect of the American Indian Library Association, and who will be moderating the discussion. The program today is sponsored jointly by the American Indian Library Association and by the Social Responsibilities Roundtable of ALA. It's actually the first of 3 programs today in the Afternoon of Social Justice, which has been organized by the Social Responsibilities Roundtable. All 3 programs are going to be recorded, so if you want to listen to them again, we'll have those recordings available soon. The struggle to defend treaty rights of Native Americans has been long and difficult, but the recent pandemic has presented special challenges to voting rights, the environment, health and safety of Native American communities. I'm honored to be able to introduce 3 outstanding speakers today, Tad Johnson, Winona LaDuke, and Dallin Maybee, who will address these issues and what you can do to help. Each of our panelists will speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have about a half an hour for questions and answers. So if questions or comments occur to you during the presentations, please send those in by the Q&A feature in Zoom. Our first speaker today is Tad Johnson. Professor Johnson is the first senior director of American Indian Tribal Nation Relations at the University of Minnesota. An enrolled member of the Boys Fort Band of Chippewa, Professor Johnson has served as a tribal attorney, as tribal court judge, and tribal administrator. He spent 5 years with the U.S. House of Representatives, ultimately becoming staff director and counsel to the Subcommittee on Native American Affairs. In 1997, President Clinton appointed Professor Johnson to chair the National Indian Gaming Commission. He's currently on the board of the Native Governance Center, serves as director of the Tribal Sovereignty Institute, and is on the board of trustees of the Udall Foundation. Tad Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Twiss. I'm honored to be here today. I'm going to kind of give a big overview of treaties. And treaties are essentially contracts between nations. And when the first European folks got here, they needed to make agreements with Indian tribes. So the Spanish were in South America looking for gold and silver. The French were down at the mouth of the St. Lawrence River looking for furs and other things. The English settled around Boston Harbor. The Dutch settled down by Manhattan and Connecticut. But when they got here, they found us, Native Americans, and they also found that we outnumbered them rather badly. And so they needed to make treaties of peace and friendship. And then there were folks like Columbus that went another direction and made slaves out of many folks down in Central America. But in general, folks wanted to survive. They needed to get food. They needed to figure out a way to get shelter And so they depended on the tribes, but they especially did not, they wanted to live in peace with the tribes that surrounded them, because the tribes had a significant military might. And so they started entering into European-style agreements with the tribes. And so wherever they were in North and South and Central America, they found there were conquests going on by Pizarro and Cortez, et cetera. But later on, there were more agreements because, as they set up colonies, especially with the English, who we eventually modeled ourselves on in the United States, they entered into things that looked like treaties. And so that continued on. And then there was the great battle for the North American continent, culminating one by one. The Dutch fell to the English. Then it came down between the French and the English, and the French and Indian War, which ended in a treaty of Paris. And under that treaty, essentially England took over most of what is now the 13 original colonies and governing them. The French, northern part, following the St. Lawrence Seaway over the Great Lakes, down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. However, after the French and Indian War, kind of created this territory west of the Appalachians that people were precluded from going to, which kind of ticked off the colonists. And but eventually what happened was the final battle for the great North American continent, at least for this part of it, would be between the Americans, colonists, and the English. And of course, prior to that, prior to the Revolutionary War, the Crown had entered into a number of treaties with the tribes in the 13 colonies. And during the time of the Revolution, the Articles of Confederation were governing, and they were very loose. They were Articles of Confederation, so they weren't creating the type of federal government we have today, per se. What they were creating was a loose confederation of states. And the rule was, under the Articles, that the federal government was supposed to make deals with the tribes, treaties, unless they cut into the rights of the states. So that was an exception that swallowed the rules. The states were always saying that, hey, you are infringing on our sovereign rights, you federal government, you shouldn't be doing that. So when they wrote the Federalist Papers, they ended up saying we have to have a strong presence when it comes to the federal government instead of the colonies or individuals over Indian tribes. And so consequently, when they wrote the Constitution in the summer of 1787, there were several important provisions in the Constitution, not the least of which was the Commerce Clause. The Commerce Clause says that Congress is authorized to negotiate commerce between states, with foreign nations, and with the Indian tribes. So if you think about that, in the Commerce Clause, there's three different types of sovereigns delineated. There's federal government, state governments, and tribal governments. And so that is frequently the source of where tribes reach to for the authority of Congress over them. But there was a treaty-making authority in the Constitution. Now, all the founders were English-trained lawyers, Jefferson, Hamilton, Madison, et cetera. And they had already been in the habit, as Englishmen, of entering the treaties with tribes. So they didn't specify Indian tribes in the treaty-making provision. They specified that, there was going to be treaty-making rights. The executive branch was going to negotiate the treaties, and by a 2/3 majority, the Senate would ratify the treaties. And so it started off with the Department of War negotiating those. And in 1849, when the Interior Department was created, that was their responsibility to enter into treaties. So overall, the United States negotiated a number of treaties, but ratified about just under 400. And so one of those things the United States has a perfect record on because it broke every single one. Now, what the treaties would frequently say, you know, the early ones were peace and friendship. Later on, there were large cessions of lands. So today, I'm in the 1854 treaty area where the Bois Forte Band, the Grand Portage Band, and the Fond du Lac Band ceded the Arrowhead region of Minnesota to the United States, but retained hunting, fishing, and gathering rights on these lands. Later on, there were treaties that, like I'm from the Bois Forte Reservation, that treaty to create that reservation went through in 1866, and later an executive order added the Vermilion part of the reservation, which is where the tribe had lived before. But anyway, so the whole United States got divided up by treaties of cession, later treaties that created reservations. Sometimes they were both, but by 1871, a good deal of the United States had already been divided up. So you had the executive branch negotiating the treaties, the Senate ratifying the treaties. Meanwhile, the House, which has the power of the purse, had was a little jealous, and I used to work for the U.S. House. I was the staff director for the subcommittee on Native American Affairs, and our main enemy was always the Senate. So when in 1871, the House got to stick a rider onto an appropriations bill that said treaty making is going to end because the House wanted the action, that went through, and so treaty making ends in 1871. He said, from now on, we're just going to do Indian affairs the way we do everything else, which is you know, the House or Senate starts a bill. When they have the same bill, it goes to the president and he signs it. So treaty making ends in 1871, but they said in the law in 1871, all treaties are going to be continuing to be good law. But a lot of things gotten forgotten over the years, and at Mille Lacs Reservation, where I work and continue to advise from time to time, the treaty rights were sort of forgotten with regard to their right inside the 1837 treaty territory. Although there were some people, my friend Don Wadle tells me there was a gentleman, George, oh golly, I'll think of his name if Don's on. Maybe he can help me, Winona, you might know. But there was a gentleman who ended up saving a copy of Kapler's treaties, and Badosky, George Badosky. And he gave the book, the Kapler's treaties, to Don Wadle, who became Commissioner of Natural Resources. They were already exercising the treaties and the 1837 rights to hunt, fish, and gather in Wisconsin, which was in the 7th Judicial District. So in the early 90s, Mille Lacs ended up in the case against the state of Minnesota over the rights to hunt, fish, and gather. That case went on until 1999. All the Wisconsin tribes joined in for the rights, and so they spent that decade fighting for the right to hunt, fish, and gather in the 1837 territory, and they won it in 1999. So, there's still arguments every year over how many fish they can take out of Lake Mille Lacs. Now, one of the things with regard to the age of COVID that got promised in the treaties, where there were educational benefits promised in the treaties, and there were healthcare and housing benefits promised in the treaties. And later on, Congress would follow up with statutes. So for housing, they did the NAHASDA Act, the Native American Self-Determination Housing Act. And for healthcare, they did the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act in 1976, which delineated a lot of responsibility for the Indian Health Service to follow through on a lot of the treaty rights that got made. So essentially, there were treaty rights that were set in place. Later on, treaty rights and the great real estate transaction that took place in the 19th century, where United States got this prime piece of real estate in Minnesota, magnificent farmland in the south, the Iron Range to the north, billions and billions of dollars of timber, mining, iron ore, and the quid pro quo was Mille got to control everything inside its 61,000 acres. Boys Fort got to control everything within its 100,000 acres, and they got the right to hunt, fish, and gather on the lands they ceded. But also part of the quid pro quo was the United States promised into perpetuity, forever, to provide them with health care, housing, other things from soup to nuts that the Bureau of Indian Affairs provides to tribes. In 1956, the Health Service split off from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and those duties to provide health care went to the Department of Health and Human Services, which today is carrying out the duties of the Indian Health Care Improvement Act and other acts of Congress. And so I'll wrap up here in a second, but I'll say that the Indian Health Service has only ever been funded about 50% of the need of Indian tribes. And then this great age of COVID-19, there's an epidemiology center that's supposed to be serving Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. And it's located in Wisconsin, and they're doing a heck of a job serving Wisconsin tribes. They divided up the monies among the tribes in the area, which is kind of ironic because some tribes are quite small in those three states, and then you have like White Earth with 20,000 people. So, but they all got the exact same amount from the epidemiology center. So as far as carrying out rights that were promised under treaty, I would say the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Indian Health Service, you know, they've held up some of their responsibilities, but as usual, moments like this, we discover the weaknesses in the system. And so there's treaty rights that were promised in the 19th century to provide proper health care have not been followed through with, especially in the area of providing tribes with proper epidemiological advice from the federal government. So with that, I will close and you can move on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much, Ted. Our next speaker is Winona LaDuke, who is an Anishinaabe or Ojibwe, who is internationally known as an activist working on issues of sustainable development, renewable energy, and food systems. She was twice the vice presidential candidate for the Green Party, is a former board member of Greenpeace USA, and is presently an advisory board member for the Trust for Public Lands, Native Lands Program, and board member of the Christensen Fund. Winona LaDuke was also the founder and is currently executive director of Honor the Earth, whose mission is to create awareness and support for Native environmental issues and to develop needed financial and political resources for the survival of sustainable Native communities. Winona LaDuke.
Ani Nindoe Maganatuk, hello my relatives. B'nai Sequin, Jinikas, Makwendodam. Thanks so much for having me here. I'm from the White Earth Reservation in northern Minnesota. That was a really long introduction, but I'm a writer and I'm a community development person. So in this moment in time, there's this intersection of crises. And in time of crises, it is always good to look at opportunity. In fact, the Chinese word for crisis is a combination of opportunity and dangerous winds. I mean, it is time to look at what we can do. And all of us are looking at this moment. And for tribes, this is a very, you know, it's always been a precarious time for us, but it's also an opportunity. And so that's really how I'm going to look at it. And Having said that, my father used to tell me a long time ago when he was alive that there would be a day when there would be no food in the store. That's what he used to say. And so I always had this in my mind that one day there'd be no food in the store. And like, none of us ever thought that was possible. I mean, Philip Deere used to tell me that he was an elder from Oklahoma, Creek elder. He used to tell me that one day water will cost more than oil. And I was like, no, that's not possible. But go try to buy a bottle of like, what's that called? Fiji water. It's like more expensive than oil. You know, so the point is that times change and we are in these times. And so, you know, my thoughts are how do we do what we need to do in this moment in time? You know, so the crises that are in front of us are not just the COVID crisis at this point. You have this civil rights crisis that is occurring, you know, which has broad implications for Indian country as well, since we have, you know, many of these same justice issues that affect the African American community also affect the Indigenous communities. And Native Lives Matter too. And then you have the climate crisis. You know, and if you think the COVID challenge is bad, just wait a couple of years and see how the climate crisis affects us. So from my perspective, you know, things are changing. Heads are toppling, statues are rolling, icons are falling. You know, so now would be the time in this moment when everything is shifting that we can begin to be the people that will that look, you know, at where it is that we are going. I'm thinking about this quote from Arundhati Roy, which I keep quoting and then I write it down, but here it is. You guys have it because you're all librarians and such. But anyway, Arundhati Roy, the Indian writer, Indians from India, she said, historically, pandemics force humans to deal with their past. A pandemic is a portal. It's a gateway between one world and the next. That's the reality of the situation. None of us would have changed our behavior if it wasn't for the bat. The bat. In Anishinaabe culture, the bat has a little puny creature, sometimes like change the world. In a lot of other people's stories as well, but in Anishinaabe culture, the bat as well. So it is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can walk through it dragging the carcasses of our prejudices and hatred, our avarice, our data banks, our dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoking skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly with little baggage, ready to enjoy, to embrace, and ready to fight for it. So I am of the latter. I'm like, take this opportunity. Now, what does that mean for tribes? That is really the question that we're asked to address. And I'm going to talk about it from the point of view from, you know, my community, the White Earth Reservation in northern Minnesota, but also this broader context. So, oh, now here I lost my fabulous PowerPoint, which I had here. Excuse me. There we go. So this is some art from our area. This is called Relatives. This is Norval Morrisseau. But in fact, you know, as big as the world is, it turns out that we are all related and we are all like in our own isolation, but we are facing the same situation. This is my reservation. This is where I live. Wawiagamug, Round Lake, in the middle of the White Earth Reservation. Now, what is really important in this time of opportunity and crisis is to look at the lay of the land. I mean, the UN climate change leadership, the UN environmental program, Ingrid Anderson talks about that this is a crisis of biodiversity, that in fact the COVID crisis came from encroaching upon nature, encroaching upon the natural world. And that, you know, you got to leave some of that stuff alone. Don't mess with Mother Nature because you get stuff that's not supposed to be in our systems that come out of the natural world. And so I just want to point out that when things went down in my community, we went in, we stayed close. This is, you know, can y'all see my slides?
Hey, Winona, sorry to interrupt. The PowerPoint is not up yet.
Oh, I'm talking away, huh? Well, how did I not share it? Excuse me. Oh gosh, the bad girl. Okay, so when we move into our community, hold on one second. Now I got to do the backwards thing here and see if I can get my PowerPoint to work. Where's a young person when you need one? Cripes. I don't know if I can figure out how to do that. Hold on. Yes. Okay, one more time. I go back to you. I apologize for this here, a little confusion. Okay, and go back to me. I can't find y'all, so I'm just going to keep talking here for a minute. Can you see my face?
Yeah, we can see your face. If you go down to Zoom under share screen and you click the
Okay,
little...
I know I did this before, so I apologize for all of you for my technical inabilities here to manage this situation. I thought I had this, but now I got to find your screen again. You've disappeared on me. Okay, here we go. I don't even know where your screen is again. All right, well, so what we did is we went and stayed in our community, in our village. Can you see me okay here?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. We stayed in our community, in our village, you know, because we was nervous to go out. So we went back in the sugar bush and we began to be like the people, like in our time, this is the new year in Ojibwe territory, when you go in your maple sugar bush and you go and you harvest your first medicine of the year, the medicine that like gives you, it's the first medicine of the year because it comes from the tree. And so I'm just talking about an indigenous response to a pandemic, which is go to what you know. And in order to do what you know, you got to have your treaty rights. You got to have your trees respected. You got to have your good life that is respected. And so our families, we went into the sugar bush. You know, we went back into the territories that we knew so well. And you know, in that, then you know, after we did that, we began to look out there in this broader picture. You know, yes, we isolated, but why did this crisis happen? And what was the ripple of the implications of this crisis on our people? You know, and so I'm kind of looking at this bigger picture. And what I'm thinking about is the fact that you know, we ended up to be this society that now we used to be totally self-sufficient. And we're not self-sufficient anymore. In fact, we're the people that go and get everything from the store. So, you know, the first pandemics that we have experienced with came from smallpox blankets. You know, those experiences are in our community. So we have this knowledge, then the trachoma and the TB. But what we know now is that in the era of globalization, things move even faster. And so the food systems are collapsing around us. That's clear. You know, the industrial food systems are big, they are not agile, they can't shift, and so they're plowing in millions of pounds of food in this country. So what's that mean for tribes? What's that mean for all of us? My own tribe, like other tribes, has become really dependent on food systems from elsewhere. And so, you know, in that reality, you know, it took like 61 days from the pandemic to begin to move out across the world. You know, from Wuhan, where I believe there's over 50,000 different contractors from America are Chinese, you know, from Wuhan. My point is that, you know, like, let me give you an example. Last night, I'm sitting with my mother and her friend. They serve shrimp. I never eat shrimp. That shrimp, I was looking at the shrimp, and that shrimp came from Scotland. And then it was sent to China to be deveined. And then it was shipped to America. Like our global food system, we are superfood insecure. That's my point. So what tribes need to look at, and what we all need to look at, is how to relocalize. Because if you're going to survive this pandemic, and then you're going to survive the next thing, you probably need to be able to take care of your people. I heard Sugar Bear Smith say one time, if you can't feed your people, you can't say you're sovereign. You know, and I really believe that that is true. You know, in this world that we are in, we need to be the people who can feed ourselves. And so, you know, a lot of tribes and nationally, people went out and bought all kinds of seeds. Seeds companies experienced a 2 or 3 times, you know, 100%, 200%, 300% increase in seed purchases. Now, a lot of tribes, this is an opportunity for food policy, you know, because there's really repressive national food policy against local food systems, but tribes have jurisdiction over our food systems, over our, you know, the wealth and our health of our people. So now is the time to step up to the plate and ensure that we can get the food that we need for our communities. So we planted. You know, the other thing is that we plant biodiversity. You know, as I was talking about where Indigenous people are, we're where the world's biodiversity is. They say that we're about 4%, maybe 5% of the world's population, but we happen to be about 75 or 80% of the world's biodiversity. Now, if you want to protect against the next pandemic, if you want to have some vitality in life, in the future, you got to protect biodiversity. So you got to support Indigenous treaty rights that protect those territories, because that's what we try to do, protect our relatives, whether they have wings or fins or roots or paws, you know, so protect that biodiversity. And then began looking at larger crises. You know, our tribe, just like every other tribe, super hard hit. We didn't have a diversified economy. We still don't. You know, a lot of tribes were counting on their gaming revenues, and in northern Minnesota, every tribe has been struggling with their casinos. My tribe is like, let's open our casino up again. Oh, I hope we can open up our casino again. And I just keep thinking, what you need is a diversified economy. You know, casinos, like, frankly, you know, I don't know, NARF, you know, all you guys might disagree with me, but I feel like the federal government has said to tribes, we support your sovereignty if you want a casino or nuclear waste dump or want to do something really egregious environmentally, but we don't support your sovereignty if you want to protect your water rights. You know, we don't want to protect, you know, if you want your land back, if you want to protect your biodiversity. And so that's the battles over tribal sovereignty that are being laid. The foundation has been years of working on it. But those really are going to need to be pushed now, because we need to protect our ability to feed and help our communities. And I'm sure that Mr. Maybee from NARF is going to talk about the close downs of these borders. You know, that's a very, very important step. Tribes saying we're going to close our borders, you know, whether Red Lake or Cheyenne River or Rosebud, as a health threat, you know, from these states that, like South Dakota, that have no laws whatsoever and are in complete denial. You know, so I see this opportunity that comes in this time, you know, for the exercise of tribal sovereignty to be far more significant in its implications, you know, over the longer haul. And then, you know, so then what else does it mean? The next crisis is coming. You know, so I'm someone who's working with many other people on what the next economy looks like, so that we are not all prey to an economy that is a globalized economy. I mean, I went to Harvard. I spent a lot of time in school. They kept talking about the economy of scale. Well, the economy of scale really makes no sense when you know, the economy of scale is predicated on a huge amount of fossil fuels, a huge amount of combustion, a huge amount of exploitation of everybody from Pakistan to, you know, China. And in this moment, we have no resilience in our communities, including in our Native communities. So this is an opportunity to figure out how to reconfigure our economies as tribes and as a nation. We weren't going to do that at any point, you know, soon. How many times have we been trying to get the Green New Deal passed? No action. But you know what you need right now is the Green New Deal. You need local food systems. You need local farmers markets. You know, in the ongoing crisis of fossil fuels and tribes, like, how are we going to pay for those propane bills and all these poor tribes this year? You're just going to have to try to get renewable energy. So on White Earth, we're working on solar thermal panels. We have this group called 8 Fire Solar, and we have solar thermal panels that we offer up for all of our, you know, we're trying to offer for our tribal members, but we need funding for it, to be honest. And in this time, you know, when you got this COVID crisis, this is, you know, opportunity to make the transitions that are going to make us more resilient in the future. So to me, the question asked about COVID and treaty rights is really this question about what self-determination looks like, and how we're going to exercise it as Native nations, and what kind of model that is, frankly, for the country, because you and I know that, you know, we need nobody has the perfect plan right now. And what we need to do is to work together, have some good sense, don't operate out of fear, operate out of hope, and grow some food so that we're going to be better in the future. You know, all the crazy things that are out there, you know, I really believe in our tribal communities. Anyway, that's all I got to say right now, and miigwech for your time.
Okay, thank you very much, Winona.
Oh, there you are.
Here I am, yep. Our third speaker today is Dallin Maybee, who is a member of the Arapaho tribe of the Wind River Reservation in Wyoming, and he's also a Seneca. He's the Assistant Director of Development for the Native American Rights Fund, which is the oldest, largest nonprofit legal organization defending the rights of Native American tribes, organizations, and people. Dallin Maybee has a Juris Doctor degree from the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law at Arizona State University. He's also an award-winning artist whose works can be found in museum and private collections worldwide, including the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of the American Indian. Dallin Maybee.
All right, thank you, Mr. Twiss. I just want to thank Winona and Tad for their comments. Treaty rights are so critical to tribal communities and nations, and just their simple ability to determine for themselves what direction and how they want to live their lives. As Winona mentioned, sovereignty encompasses a lot of different things. You know, it's, you are making decisions for not just yourself, and incidentally, as you practice your own personal sovereignty, you get to decide how you want to live, what area you want to work in, the decisions that you feel best suit you and your family to bring you the most happiness within your personal life, right? Well, as tribal communities, we extend that to our relatives, to our loved ones, to the people that make up our culture. And so when we talk about concepts of sovereignty, we just simply want to live our lives in the way that best suit us and according to our culture and traditions. So as Mr. Twiss mentioned, I am Northern Arapaho and Seneca. I grew up in Western New York on the Seneca Nation of Indians, Cattaraugus Indian Reservation. But I'm enrolled Northern Arapaho from Wyoming, Central Wyoming. We share a reservation with the Eastern Band of Shoshone. But I currently work in Boulder, Colorado. As Mr. Twiss mentioned, the Native American Rights Fund is the oldest and largest nonprofit law firm dedicated to asserting and defending rights of Indian tribes and organizations and individuals. And so as kind of the premier Indian legal defense fund, we play a pretty critical role in not only defending these rights, but as we also function as a thought leader for state, federal, tribal law and policy. We've got a 50-year reputation of service to Indian country. And so we've become an ally to a lot of different communities as we've represented them over the years, just to help them in constructing the foundations of these laws and policies that allow them to not only exercise their inherent sovereignty rights, but live according to the traditions as they want. We have approximately 50 ongoing cases and programs at any given time. I just kind of want to touch base on some of the bigger ones. Over these last 50 years, we've assisted tribes in getting re-recognized. We also represent a lot of cases based on their impact towards Indian country. And so we don't really do a lot with criminal law or individual casework, but we're guided by these 5 priorities. We have a board of directors. We are a legal nonprofit with a special 501c3 IRS status. But early on in NARF's history, the board decided that we needed to be guided by 5 priorities. And these 5 priorities would allow us to best support the preservation of tribal existence. And so the priorities include the protection of tribal natural resources, the promotion of American Indian rights, holding governments, state and federal governments accountable to Native American tribal communities, whether it's for the enforcement of our treaty rights. We develop and educate the area of federal Indian law, just to help our neighbors understand some of the rights, laws, and issues that we undergo. So some of our programming involves a lot of coalition building, a lot of networking with similar minded tribal organizations or tribal communities. For example, we host the National Indian Law Library, which is a clearinghouse of all state and federal laws. We include a lot of tribal laws and constitutions. We are open to the public. We get thousands of requests for assistance each month. We have a pretty bare bones staff in there, but our director is doing a phenomenal job at just helping people, individuals, attorneys, other organizations, and even oftentimes government representatives who need to understand what federal Indian law is and what it really means for them. It's an incredible service. As part of that service, one of the things that the Tribal Supreme Court Project does is they track state and federal cases that have the potential to appear in front of the Supreme Court. For a while back in the 90s and early 2000s, we were really seeing rather aggressive and pretty nasty Supreme Court in terms of the decisions that they were handing down. And so we realized that we needed to establish a coalition of allies and advocates, of academics, of other Indian law practitioners to sort of strategize how we were going to address some of these potential cases. What would the legal strategy be? What would it look like? And hopefully, with the best strategy put forward, we could start to see more favorable results. And in fact, there's some incredibly important cases that are in front of the Supreme Court right now. Not every case is granted cert, but we track which ones are on their way, which ones are being granted. And we even offer services to those tribal and commercial law firms that perhaps need some assistance, whether it's just simply through an amicus brief or whether it's literally practicing oral arguments and running through some of these points that might appear in front of the Supreme Court. We have some other programs that include peacemaking initiatives, reasserting some of our traditional core concepts and values for tribal inclusion, whether it's within their own tribal courts. It could be something as simple as a mediation sort of alternative to a penal imposed sentence. We do a lot with sacred site protection, with a lot of religious freedom stuff. But I kind of want to hone in on some of the more treaty applicable cases that we're taking on right now, because it has real world implications, not only for us, but as we're seeing with some of our environmental work, implications for our neighbors as well. And so we're formulating and creating these networks of allies, which in some cases, as reservation communities know, those border towns aren't always the friendliest. And so when you see things like the pandemic forcing tribes to take and practice sovereignty in order to protect the health and welfare of their own communities, it really puts them at odds with a rather paternalistic system that wants to tell them, well, this is how you should do things. They forget that we have thousands of years of making our own decisions and protecting the health and welfare of our tribes. And so what is the backstop? Where is the line between a state and a tribe within that state being able to make those decisions? And that's where the treaty rights become implicated. When I grew up, one of my first exposures to treaties was the Treaty of Canandaigua, which implicated a relationship between the Seneca Nation and some of those Eastern Woodlands tribes and the state of New York and the federal government. But we would receive treaty cloth. We still do. We receive treaty cloth. You can go and pick up a bunch of yards of muslin if you need it. It's really, really interesting. But for example, North Dakota, before we get into some of this stuff, North Dakota had created this what they call the voter protection law, House Bill 1369. And they said, well, you got to have an ID that's recognized as well as a physical address on the ID, just so you can participate in this really important election process. It's a process that is designed for every citizen in the US to simply have a voice to who represents them at a community, state, and federal level. But the problem is a lot of reservations and tribal communities, they're so rural, so remote, they don't have an actual physical address. And so how do you comply with this state law to participate in the state process and the federal process if you don't have even a license or an ID administered by the state, let alone a physical address? So a couple tribal communities in North Dakota filed suit. Last fall, we went to oral arguments, I think in early January, actually. But they initially, it didn't look good, because we had in 2018 we had filed for a temporary restraining order to prohibit this. It looks and sounds like voter suppression, right? Because you're eliminating an entire community of active voters. Well, despite the court knowing that it was going to disenfranchise certain voters, they still refused to grant this TRO, saying that the overwhelming majority somehow needed this action, this law, against the rights of a few. Now, when you're talking about a tribal community, you're talking about people like veterans, people who have literally put their lives on the line so that they could protect these very important political processes. And so luckily, just recently, there had been some motions to dismiss by the state of North Dakota. In oral arguments, we laid out our argument, and then luckily, when the court denied those motions from the state, and it looked like it was going to go to trial, they decided to settle. And so we were able to protect those rights. People can engage in the political process. They're working with the tribes. Some tribes now have actual physical addresses. The United States Postal Service has helped with that. And with the current political climate, I think you're seeing a divisiveness that isn't necessarily unprecedented for us, but is definitely being experienced by people that aren't from tribal communities. And so people are realizing, my gosh, if they can take away voting rights from Native voters, what's to say they won't gerrymander our own communities or create really prohibitive voter election laws. So here we are. Treaty rights are also implicated very much so in some of the environmental work that we do. For example, if you followed some of the Dakota Access Pipeline fights and now the Keystone XL pipeline fights, you're seeing the treaty rights in process. So initially, for example, the Keystone XL pipeline had been rejected in 2015 from President Obama. It was going to transport 500,000 barrels of crude oil across the United States line from Canada. And who was it really going to benefit? It wasn't like it was increasing our own oil reserves. It wasn't like it was going to create thousands of jobs for American people. It literally would benefit just a handful of stakeholders and shareholders in this oil company, but at what cost? They would reap all the benefit of a pipeline crossing multiple states, tribal communities, all the way down to the Gulf, and then it would be shipped off overseas and sold to other countries. Now, who bears the risk of that pipeline? It wasn't necessarily shareholders who would be out maybe a little bit of money from a spill. It would be all the people that lay along these pipelines. And it's not like the risk was minimal. They try to minimize the impact, but we're seeing spills even in new pipelines. We have currently hundreds of pipelines that crisscross the United States every day. But why would we endanger an entire community along these pipeline routes for the benefit of so few people? And so in 2017, Trump literally invited TransCanada to renew their request for a permit. There was some litigation for numerous violations of the law and the environmental process. And so suits were filed. Trump and his shenanigans decided to rescind that permit process and actually do a presidential declaration which attempts to supersede all these established processes for protecting the environment, for making assessments to make sure that these things are going to be protective of the areas that they go through. Well, because of that presidential proclamation, it actually is a very difficult legal hurdle to overcome. And so a couple of the pipeline suits that were filed by various environmental groups on behalf of landowners where the pipeline crosses, those were tossed as moot. They couldn't overcome them. What I think a lot of people didn't understand is that the treaty claims that we made on behalf of some of our tribal clients, however, survived, and they needed to be addressed. And so we are the tip of the spear for this pipeline fight, simply because we are asserting under those treaties that the federal government has a duty to ensure the health and welfare of our tribal communities. We conceded a lot of things in order to make these treaties happen, and we just simply want the treaties to be enforced. We talk about, well, what is the claim? What is the damage? Well, not only the damage to the aquifers and the waterways, but there's issues with man camps and missing and murdered Indigenous women. Per capita, we have higher rates of women who go missing every year from tribal communities. And with an already stretched thin law enforcement service, some of these things don't ever get investigated appropriately. It's literally a very detrimental form of a pandemic that's occurring against our women and children. There's sacred sites that would be trampled by these pipelines. There's all kinds of things that, thankfully, because of these treaty rights, allow us to bring suits. But the pipelines aren't the only things. For example, the Arctic National Refuge, Wildlife Refuge in Alaska is home to one of the last and largest pristine environments. It's also home to one of the largest caribou herds that migrate in and out for their mating and for the Gwich'in tribes up there. It's a huge part of their culture, of their religion. They have a relationship with those caribou, much like the Bristol Bay communities have relationships with those salmon. It's integrated into who they are and their cultural identity. But Senator Murkowski decided that she wanted to open it up to oil and gas exploration and ultimately mining. And so NARF is assisting those tribes and protecting those rights. I'm going to try and summarize some of these relatively quickly because I know that we're running short on time. Bristol Bay is a similar community issue up in Alaska, where Pebble Mine is looking to increase and expand their mining operations, and it'll have a devastating effect on those salmon populations. And after decades of advocacy from the tribal communities, and not even just the tribal communities, but the local communities, because it's a large part of their economy, we're able to get protections in place to assure that those salmon in that bay would be protected, have all once again been attacked by this current administration and by Alaskan government officials who want to place profits in front of people. That's the bottom line. We've realized that the current administration has removed a lot of these environmental protections to simply benefit just a handful of people. And so the Native American Rights Fund looks at these cases, sees if there's heavy impact on tribal communities, and then decides whether or not to take them. We do a lot of water cases. We represented Agua Caliente on a decades-long water case. We assisted on some Klamath water cases. Even the hunting rights as asserted by treaties are things that we've taken on. Now, currently, the pandemic has interesting implications for the tribal exercise of our treaty rights, simply because, again, these tribal governments need to take the steps necessary to protect their communities. And so what we're seeing, for example, is the Oglala Nation, Sioux Tribe, and the Cheyenne River Sioux have decided to create roadblocks. And just kind of a quick summary, they're allowing ambulances and fire services to come in, but they really are just simply there to make sure that people with exhibited symptoms of COVID aren't going to endanger the communities. Now, one of the things that a lot of people don't realize is that the health service that we have, yes, some of the treaty rights provide for small clinics, or for example, in Phoenix, the urban health community has a medical center that's a large hospital. But what is the level of care that they're really being able to provide, especially in some of these rural communities? When you talk about a pandemic and the danger of that pandemic, yes, it appears relatively manageable if you have the resources to handle it. With only a certain amount of ventilators, with only a certain amount of doctors, it would only take a handful of cases to overwhelm any sort of tribal community health service or clinic, if they even have a clinic within 50 miles of their reservation or their community. And so these tribes are just simply wanting to protect their own tribal communities from this incredible danger. And so Governor Noem from South Dakota had taken issue with these blockades and said, well, you can't do that. You can't, these are state and federal roads, you can't be blockading them. Well, when that boundary, when that road crosses that boundary, it is considered Indian country. And there's actually pretty established precedents from the 90s that say that tribes can make those decisions for what happens within those roads that cross tribal boundaries. When she realized that she couldn't supersede, and even some of the state legislators had written a letter saying, look, this is their decision to make. When she realized she was going to lose that legal battle, she appealed to President Trump. And interestingly, just last week, the Cheyenne River Sioux filed a suit against President Trump and against his chief of staff, Mark Meadows, because they had literally called and alluded that if they did not remove these roadblocks and work with the state of South Dakota on them, that they would withhold the COVID assistance money. And so that case was filed last week by Big Fire Law and the Cheyenne River Sioux. Well, we're waiting to see what their response will be. But hopefully they realize that it's just simply tribes asserting their sovereignty to protect their populations. When it comes to things like bear's ears, for example, we're trying to help people understand that this just isn't a tribal issue. NARF represents 5 tribes on some litigation that, Obama had set aside 1.5 million acres of Bears Ears National Monument for federal protection as a national park. And again, it was after decades of consultation with local communities, with the tribes, with a lot of advocacy by environmental groups to simply help preserve these incredible natural resources and monuments. But once this administration came into power, they started to, they mentioned they were going to do a small evaluation of the national park. And then it became later a reduction by 2/3. Because again, they wanted to open it up to natural gas and oil exploration. So we filed suit to protect some of these sacred sites, to protect some of the legacy of what is American. It's not just a tribal legacy. This is our collective historical record, right? Americans are composed of a lot of different cultures, a lot of different communities. Yes, we are first Americans, but we have literally opened our doors and our lands to the benefit of all. It wasn't always under the best of terms, but these treaties are meant to solidify that relationship. And so the Bears Ears litigation, once again, involved NARF asserting on behalf of these tribes some of these very incredible just actions to help us protect our sovereign rights. And I think I'm getting the high sign from Mr. Twiss. So I'll wrap it up with a real quick plea to just, you know, if you really want to, a lot of times we get asked, how can we help? How can we be a better ally? How can we help understand some of these issues? You know, one of the things is get on some of our websites. Go to Honor the Earth website. Go to NARF, Native American Rights Fund. As I mentioned, has a really robust caseload, and we post routine updates on what's happening. See where it's going to impact. Educate your communities. See how you can assist. There's a lot of resources out there, and NARF is just simply not only asserting these rights, but trying to help tribal communities be good neighbors, protect not just our rights, but the rights of our neighbors and the communities within which we live as well. The website is www.narf or narf.org.
All right, thank you very much, Dallin. I want to turn the program over now to Cindy Hohl, who is the president-elect of the American Indian Library Association, and she's going to moderate the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you to our impressive panel. We appreciate all of your wisdom and knowledge that you have shared with us today. If participants would like to start sharing some questions in the Q&A box, we can certainly ask some of our panelists to share some additional information. I had the first question, and I thought maybe Tad would want to take this one. As communities prepare to submit their information for the U.S. Census, can you share with us how the federal funding allocations impact tribal communities in regard to treaty rights?
Well, it's very important, and there are organizations in Minnesota that are making sure that every Native American person in the state gets counted. When it comes to Indian Health Service and Bureau of Indian Affairs funding and Department of Housing and Urban Development housing funding, population becomes very important. Also, as far as American Indian children in public schools throughout the nation, there is something called Johnson O'Malley monies, and registering Indian kids as Indian kids in public schools and counting the number of Native Americans living in a particular school district can be very important as far as allocating funds. And so the census is all important, and tribes are constantly being undercounted. We've got a lot of folks that may move from house to house on the reservation, and so we sometimes don't make it easy. That's why we've got a movement right now to turn the counting over to our own people, so that the census of reservations is taken by people who know the reservations, and that's important. I think you're muted, Cindy.
Thank you, Tad. I had a follow-up question for you as well. So you briefly touched on the CARES Act funding. Are there any other communities that have received similar threats from the federal government in regards to withholding those monies? Or Tad, is that something that you would like to share more information on?
Well, it's been the CARES Act funding has been a very frustrating experience for the tribes. There have been challenges as to, number of court challenges as to, it started with, there are 13 Alaska Native corporations, and in the initial thinking by the Bureau of Indian Affairs on that, they were each going to get a share, and tribes objected to that. It went to federal court, and there's been a series of court decisions where the funding has been dribbling out bit by bit. And so I assume other other groups may be having this difficulty, but tribes are, as Dallin was saying, we're very susceptible to getting the disease. And also, as Winona was saying, our economies are dependent on one particular industry. And so when that industry shuts down and when our people get sick, we're in a hard way. And we like to assert our sovereignty wherever we can, but every once in a while, the federal trust responsibility kicks in, and as I say, the big real estate transaction that took place in the 19th century, the United States still has trust responsibility obligations that flow from promises that were made in the 19th century, and later on promises that were made by statute, now promises that were made by the CARES Act, that the courts have to enforce and try to do a better job than the Treasury Department did in determining allocations. And so they're still rather slow on that.
Thank you. Dallin, you brought up voting rights. Can you share with our audience why a physical address is required, and in regards to how reservation lands were set up for residences?
Sure. Well, and that's kind of a difficult question because a lot of communities were set up for a variety of different reasons. And it wasn't always because it had the best hunting and agricultural opportunities. It was sort of to remove certain tribes to areas where they thought they would be the least problematic, right? Entire communities of Lakota people were removed to the Black Hills until gold was discovered there, and they decided, oh, wait a minute, we need some. And so in direct violation of some of those treaties, they moved in. They didn't allow, they did allow those encroachments from miners and from communities and corporations eventually. That was a case that was litigated, and in protests, they still refuse to accept compensation for those Black Hills because it is a place of incredible spiritual importance. Now, when it comes to voting rights, NARF is part of a voting rights coalition that's made up of a lot of different organizations, tribal communities, people that want to simply help people engage in this political process. So when North Dakota created this what they call the voter protection law, the idea, I think, is well-intentioned. Yes, we should have some protections to ensure that one person gets one vote, that there's not, weird voter fraud things happening. But then there are people who say, well, no, this was very intentional. This was a move. They knew that by disenfranchising these 3,000 or 4,000 people from this community in a place where some of the elections are decided by a few hundred votes, that's a huge, powerful opportunity for a community to have real engagement and real representation. unless something like this voter ID law comes into place. Part of it was the reality of the size. The United States Postal Service is in charge of creating physical addresses for people. But when your community encompasses 1.5 million square acres with a population of maybe 2,000 people, the reality of a guy or a gal driving around all day to drop off mail just isn't realistic. And so P.O. boxes are kind of the norm for some of the community and little city centers. People have to often drive 30 or 40 miles just to get to their local post office box. And so there's both sides of the argument, that it was an intentional act to disenfranchise voters. And then others say, well, no, it's meant to protect the process. Well, whatever the gray area is, everybody should have the opportunity to engage in it.
Thank you. There's another follow-up question for you, Dallin. We have a question here. They're interested to know if any of the suits that you mentioned are getting support and solidarity from state attorney general offices.
Yes and no. Oftentimes the state AG is at sort of the beck and call of whatever governor is in office, right? Whatever party controls, with a few exceptions. And so unfortunately, we are a nonpartisan organization. We'll file suit no matter what administration is in place if it starts to infringe on tribal rights. But for example, the Anwar and Bristol Bay state AG has unfortunately not come out and said they support these actions. And so, it all depends on the specific circumstance. To my knowledge, I don't know of any AG that has come out and said, this is a good idea on some of these bigger cases. I think they are there to protect the interest of the state. I have some, well, that's neither here nor there, but.
Thank you. Winona, we have a question for you as well. So in relation to oil fracking and pipelines, you briefly mentioned information about the correlation between tribal communities and the surrounding areas. How about the threat of the man camps in regards to these areas? So we have an environmental threat that we're dealing with, as well as a societal threat. In regards to missing murdered Indigenous women, what are some ways that we can share information through our librarian networks and through information channels to help support those communities?
I think that a lot of can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. I think that a lot of the, issues that we are talking about are, kind of the same broad issues that Black Lives Matters is talking about in terms of like how the police systems have treated, have kind of ignored these cases of our women, and our men, in these circumstances and the practices of police. I think that the larger question is really like, why you want to let these people around your communities. You've got, we have a pretty long history of, I really like that clause in the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty. I said it's the bad man clause, where you can exclude bad men from the reservation. I was like, I'd like to use that clause. We should exclude bad men from the treaty territory. Those bad men are people who bring man camps, all of those issues are systemic issues. And so support us in our struggles to keep our water, support us in our struggles to protect our land. And then also, y'all heard my plea. It's like time for a transition, no time like the present. The fossil fuels era, BP is dumping its fossil fuels and going renewables. The time is over. And so, it's really like, I heard this one chief from the Clayoquot Sound area in British Columbia talked about 20 years ago. Johnny was his name, I forget his last name, but he said, you know, talking to the Canadian government is a lot like talking to a cannibal. You can sit and make as much small talk as you want, but in the end, you know exactly what they're after. And to me, that's kind of the point. It's like federal, state governments, corporations. It's like talking to a cannibal. They want what we have, and the time has to come where the cannibal backs off. And, you know, at this point in time, you know, we're all facing these threats, and these threats are related to a lot of the choices that have been made by the society. So, you know, what we want is justice. And what we want is the ability to continue as Indigenous nations. And I think, as I, you know, illustrated in my presentation, I mean, you want to be on our side because we're the biodiversity, and life's in biodiversity. Life is not in a monocrop, a GMO monocrop. Life is in biodiversity.
Thank you, Winona. In regards to the times of COVID-19, can you share some ideas as to how we can protect our Native communities in regards to the statistical information that the federal government is sharing? It almost seems as if it's an erasure, an intentional erasure of our people when we aren't included in the demographical information as these testing sites are coming available and as more tribal communities are receiving access to tests as well. What does that mean for us exactly if we cease to exist on paper?
You know, we have a pretty long history of erasure. You know, that's our knowledge. I mean, people are talking about taking down statues as erasing history. I was like, no, I think that Nick Estes says, no, erasing history is when you put up a statue and you don't even know the people who live there. You know, I mean, we've been erased for a long time. And I think that, you know, a lot of people talk about this moment. I think that Standing Rock was a real wake up for a lot of people, you know, and I think that we've just been getting more awake since. And I don't predict that we're going to go back to sleep. And so there'll be attempts to erase us. But, you know, as you can see in Minnesota, I'm proud to be from Minnesota. First Lieutenant Governor, Native woman elected. More Native people are getting elected across the board. I mean, you look at Ruth Anna Buffalo. I mean, we're talking about these voting rights cases, and the guy who proposed the law which restricted voting rights for Indigenous people, or, you know, in North Dakota, you know, basically significant effect, he lost his election to a Native woman. And that woman, Ruth Anna Buffalo, she has to stand up to racism all the time. She's a big, strong woman. I just love her. But, you know, you think about this, so we just need to keep pushing. And I really do think that this time, it's a portal. Keep pushing, you know, because there is consciousness. People are everywhere want to figure out how to change. You know, people have felt bad about how things have been. A lot of people, some people don't care, like Donald Trump, but a lot of people do want to do the right thing. So use this opportunity to not get back to normal, but get better. Let's use this opportunity to get better as tribes and as you know, all societies. I think it's a great opportunity, and, you know, I'm happy to be here in it. I'm rolling up my sleeves, chewing my nails a little bit, but rolling up my sleeves and just keep going.
Thank you. Another question in the Q&A, and they ask, they're curious to know which Congress members and senators have actually demonstrated that they are pro-Indian and pro-treaty enforcement. And so those who could advocate for tribal communities and to help more with federal aid. Is there a network of federal officials that are on the ready and prepared to serve and understand the needs of Indian country?
Dallin, that's you, isn't it?
Well, interestingly, let me actually go to the Supreme Court, because as I mentioned before, we were seeing a series of rather detrimental decisions. But for example, when Gorsuch was going to be confirmed, there was sort of an uproar because he was a traditionally very conservative justice, and we weren't quite sure what a very heavy conservative court would look like for us again, and we weren't very happy. But some leaders in Indian country, including John Echohawk, said, well, he is coming out of Montana. He's very well versed in Indian country and federal Indian law, and we're actually seeing some very decent decisions with his support. He crossed the line, and he engages with, I think, the liberal justices in a lot of ways to perhaps educate them on Indian law and those implications. And one was a recent treaty rights case that involved off-reservation hunting rights. We expected that to go a completely different direction. This gentleman was charged by the state of Wyoming for hunting off-reservation, and he asserted treaty rights, saying, "Hey, look, these were never abrogated. They were never diminished. I'm just simply engaging in my treaty rights to provide for my family and subsistence hunt." And they actually decided that positively. Now, the state of Wyoming has since engaged in a little bit of shenaniganry to try and say, well, you still have to comply with the state of Wyoming hunting regulations. So we'll see where that goes. But when it comes to senators and state officials, we often see allies all over the place. You know, Senator McCain, the late Senator McCain, for all his conservatism, had assisted in a lot of these very important federal acts. ICWA, a lot of our repatriation rights and things were bipartisan efforts to just simply assert tribal rights, and we're grateful for those senators. It'd be probably hard to go state by state to highlight some of the more active allies, because it often can vary. In some cases, for example, Senator McCain wasn't the best ally when it came to protecting Apache sacred sites that he wanted to open up for economic reasons for the state of Arizona. So it really is sort of a case-by-case thing. But if please reach out. You can find my email on the NARF website. And if you're from a certain community, we can definitely help you track down some people that you could be in contact with to provide letters of support.
Cindy, can I just add to the congressional thing real quick?
Please do.
So there was a time when there was kind of Daniel Inouye, John McCain, and Mo Udall, and very few others advocating, Ben Nighthorse Campbell. But today in the U.S. House, they have caucuses. So the most famous one is the Black Caucus. They push civil rights and other things. But the largest caucus in the U.S. House today is the Native American Caucus, which originally, the original chairs were Betty McCollum from Minnesota and the gentleman from Oklahoma, who's a Chickasaw. Now our two Native American congresswomen that are Democrats are heading that up. But they inform members. So if you have a tribe in your district, you'll join the Native American Caucus, and it's actually become a fairly powerful voting block on certain things. And over the years, especially with the advent of some tribes getting some monies from Indian gaming, the National Congress of American Indians as a lobbying organization has been strengthened, and so has the National Indian Gaming Association. And Betty McCollum just got off of as the head of the caucus, and now she is the head of, there are 13 subcommittees, well, 12 subcommittees on the House side, and they're so powerful, those 12 people are known as the 12 Cardinals, and Betty is the one in charge of Interior and related agencies, which means the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Indian Health Service. So she has been a great help to tribes.
Thank you, Tad. Before we wrap up, are there any last thoughts that any of our panelists would like to share?
Oh, wait, no, where am I? Just thanks again for having us. And for more information on our work, www.honorearth.org, or Winona's Hemp, because We're interested in the new green revolution, and we think it's hemp. We know it's hemp. So more information on that. Thank you so much for being interested in these issues.
Thank you, Winona.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you to the organizers. It's great to be able to discuss and have a candid chat about some of the issues in Indian country. There's so many organizations doing incredibly important work. We're great allies with some of the things happening with the Black Lives Movement. As Winona mentioned, it's not going away. We're glad that the light is being shown into the dark places of the closet, because it'll just make us a better and stronger America. So our website again is www.narf.org. We'll send you annual reviews, and we do a legal review 3 times a year, which talks about some of the more recent updates on some of our casework and programming. But we'd love to send you information and see how we can all fight this thing together.
Thank you, Dallin.
I just want to say, Jibwe Miigwech, big thanks to you, and it's an honor to serve on a panel with Winona and Dallin. I feel like we're at this moment right now in history, and Winona was alluding to it, where change is underfoot. And I think in Minnesota, it partly started with the election of Governor Walz and Peggy Flanagan, and now we have a new president at the University of Minnesota, and there's kind of a new attitude towards Indian tribes. And I wouldn't have taken this job. I was very happy as a professor, but they said, here's an opportunity to actually implement change. And it's a unique moment in history. And so I'm glad to be here and part of it, because it's taken a long time to get a friendly state government in place here in Minnesota. And as Dallin was saying, a lot of AGs have come down against tribes. We have one that just came out, and finally, after 150 more years, recognized that the Mille Lacs Reservation exists, which is something the Obama administration and every administration has said since 1855. And so this is the first in Minnesota to have a friendly governor and a friendly attorney general. So knock wood, I hope it lasts. So miigwech, thank you.
Thank you all. And on behalf of the American Indian Library Association, we're so honored that you joined us all today. There's so much information that we can share from Indian country to all of the communities that we live and work within and that support us. We will have a resource guide that we're sharing, along with a reading list, the presenter website information, and also alanet.org is our website. So on behalf of the American Indian Library Association and the Social Responsibility Roundtable, Tom Twiss is going to close us out. We would like to remind everyone that we are on Indigenous land. Chi-miigwech, Mado, Hohu, and Pidamaye. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Cindy. Thanks for a very nice job moderating that discussion. And I want to thank all the speakers for really fine presentations. And as Cindy said, you can look forward to reading lists. Librarians can't do a program without putting together bibliographies. So those will be available afterwards. We want to thank the American Indian Library Association for co-sponsoring this program with us, and also the American Library Association for making all this possible. So thanks so much for everybody. And thanks for everybody who attended today too. Thank you. Okay, bye-bye.
Goodbye.